Before we dive into these spine-chilling tales of haunted roads, I have a question for you. Have you ever experienced anything paranormal while traveling at night? Maybe a shadowy figure, eerie sounds, or something you just couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments below. I'll be reading and responding to the scariest ones. These roads are more than haunted. They're cursed. Tonight, you'll hear terrifying tales of ghostly apparitions, vanishing travelers, and eerie screams that will make you think twice before driving at night. Story number 1. Jake Weston was no stranger to long-haul drives. As a seasoned truck driver, he had traversed countless highways, back roads, and dirt trails. But this night was different. Jake sat in the driver's seat of his 18-wheeler, staring at the narrow, serpentine road ahead, illuminated only by his high beams. The locals called it the Road of the Lost. They had begged him not to take this shortcut. "It's cursed," an old man at the gas station had warned earlier that evening. His sunken eyes seemed to hold the weight of something unspeakable. People disappear up there. No bodies, no wreckage, just gone. Jake had waved off the warnings with a dismissive laugh. Superstitions, ghost stories, none of that had ever fazed him. Deadlines, however, were very real. He had a cargo to deliver, and shaving off 3 hours by cutting through the mountain pass was worth ignoring a bit of small-town folklore. The truck's tires crunched gravel as he veered onto the winding trail. The road was suffocatingly narrow, with dense trees on one side and a sheer drop on the other. The air outside was eerily still, heavy with a silence that felt unnatural. Jake turned up the volume on his radio to fill the void, but after a few minutes it fizzled into static. "Cheap piece of junk," he muttered, smacking the radio. The road twisted sharply, forcing Jake to slow down. His headlights illuminated the cliff edge, where an old rusted road sign dangled precariously. The words were almost illegible, but he could make out "Turn back now" scrawled across the battered metal. Jake shook his head. "These people really commit to their ghost stories," he muttered, chuckling nervously. As he continued, an unsettling sensation crept over him. The trees on either side of the road seemed unnaturally tall, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. His GPS, a reliable companion on countless journeys, began to glitch. The blue line recalculated over and over, spinning him in endless loops. "Recalculating," the device chirped in a robotic monotone. "Recalculating." Jake felt the first stirrings of unease. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For the briefest moment, he thought he saw a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road behind him. But when he blinked, it was gone. "Get a grip, Jake," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The truck rolled on, its engine humming steadily. But the silence outside was oppressive, almost alive. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, he thought it was just branches brushing against the side of the truck, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from above. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel. He glanced at the passenger side mirror and caught a fleeting glimpse of movement on the roof of the cab. Probably just a bird, he told himself, though his voice betrayed his growing fear. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the roof, followed by the screech of something dragging along the metal. Jake slammed on the brakes, bringing the massive vehicle to a screeching halt. The truck groaned as it settled, and the night swallowed the sound of the engine. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a deep breath, Jake grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cab. The air was icy, cutting through his jacket like a blade. He aimed the flashlight at the roof, but saw nothing unusual. "Probably some loose debris," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. As he climbed back into the truck, his eyes caught something in the distance. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the faint glow of his headlights, was a woman. Her figure was pale and ghostly, her long, blood-stained dress swaying in a wind Jake couldn't feel. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her face was hidden by a curtain of matted black hair. "Hey, are you okay?" Jake called out, his voice shaky. The woman didn't respond. She simply raised a hand and pointed toward the forest. A shiver ran down Jake's spine. Every instinct screamed at him to get back in the truck and leave, but he felt rooted to the spot. Then, in a voice so faint it was almost a whisper, she spoke. "Turn back." Jake blinked, and she was gone. Jake slammed the truck door shut, his heart hammering in his chest. His breathing was shallow, his fingers trembling as they fumbled to shift the truck into gear. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He hadn't slept well in days, and exhaustion was known to make people see things. But deep down, Jake knew better. The engine rumbled to life, and the headlights pierced through the thick darkness ahead. The narrow road beckoned, twisting like a serpent into the black abyss of the mountains. Jake gritted his teeth and pressed on. The air inside the cab grew colder, his breath visible as faint puffs in the dim light of the dashboard. The radio crackled to life suddenly, spewing garbled static before settling on a faint melody. It was a woman's voice, singing a haunting lullaby in a language Jake couldn't understand. The tune was sorrowful yet oddly hypnotic, pulling at the edges of his sanity. "Damn thing's busted," Jake muttered, reaching for the dial to turn it off. But no matter how many times he twisted the knob, the song persisted, growing louder. Then came the tapping again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the passenger side window. Jake's heart leapt into his throat. He glanced sideways, and his blood ran cold. There, pressed against the glass, was the shadowy outline of a hand. Long, skeletal fingers slid slowly down the window, leaving behind streaks that glistened like blood in the pale moonlight. He swerved reflexively, the truck veering dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Gravel sprayed from beneath the tires, tumbling into the void below. Jake straightened the wheel with a panicked jerk, his hands slick with sweat. "Get a grip, man!" he barked at himself. But the presence outside the truck didn't let up. The hand vanished, only to reappear at the windshield. The shadowy figure Jake had glimpsed earlier now loomed directly in front of the truck, illuminated by the glaring headlights. It wasn't human. Its eyes were hollow pits, its mouth a gaping black maw that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. Its body was shrouded in mist, shifting and writhing like smoke caught in a violent wind. Jake slammed his foot on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt with a deafening screech. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It simply stood there, staring at him with its empty eyes. And then it lunged. The windshield cracked under the force of an unseen impact, spiderweb fractures spreading rapidly across the glass. Jake screamed, throwing the truck into reverse. The tires spun wildly, struggling for traction on the loose gravel. The figure dissolved into the mist, but the oppressive presence lingered. Jake's instincts screamed at him to flee, but the road behind him seemed just as menacing as the one ahead. "I'm not dying here," he muttered through gritted teeth, slamming the gearshift into drive. The truck roared forward, its headlights cutting through the dense fog that had inexplicably rolled in. The road became a maze of sharp turns and steep inclines, the GPS useless as it continued to recalculate endlessly. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as Jake drove deeper into the fog, they grew louder, more distinct. "Join us," the voices hissed. Jake shook his head violently, trying to drown them out. "You're losing it, Jake. It's all in your head." But the whispers persisted, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. Male, female, young, old. They all spoke in unison, their words a chilling chant. "You cannot leave. You belong to the road now." Suddenly, the fog parted, and Jake found himself staring at a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the woman in the blood-stained dress. This time, Her face was visible. Her skin was pale and cracked, her eyes sunken and glowing faintly. Her mouth moved, but the words didn't match the movements. "Why didn't you turn back?" she rasped, her voice echoing in the cab despite the closed windows. Jake swerved again, narrowly avoiding her, but the truck's rear tires slid dangerously close to the cliff's edge. He caught a glimpse of her in his side mirror as she reached out, her disfigured face twisted into a look of pure rage, and then she was gone. The truck rolled to a stop, and Jake sat there trembling, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't know how much more he could take. The road seemed endless, a nightmarish loop he couldn't escape. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. Jake's breathing was shallow, his chest tight with fear. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was stuck at 3:13 a.m. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him like a physical weight. Jake felt a presence in the cab with him, though he was too afraid to look. "Jake." The voice was right next to his ear, a breathy whisper that sent a jolt of terror through him. Slowly he turned his head, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else. And there, sitting in the passenger seat, was the woman. Her head lolled to the side, her eyes locked onto his with a lifeless stare. Blood dripped from the corners of her mouth, staining the front of her tattered dress. Jake opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Jake's body froze in place, every muscle paralyzed by the icy grip of fear. The woman in the passenger seat didn't move, but her presence seemed to fill the cab like a suffocating fog. Her blood-stained dress shimmered faintly in the dim light of the dashboard, and her lifeless eyes bore into him with a weight that made it impossible to look away. Then, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. Jake's throat tightened as he struggled to find his voice. What do you want from me?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. The woman tilted her head, the motion unnatural and jerky, as if her neck were a loose hinge. "This road, it doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. And neither do we." Before Jake could respond, she began to dissolve. Her body disintegrated into a cloud of black mist that swirled violently inside the cab, clawing at his skin like icy tendrils. The temperature plummeted further, and Jake felt his breath hitch as the mist seeped into his lungs, choking him. He flung the door open and tumbled out onto the road, gasping for air. The truck's headlights illuminated the dense fog ahead, but the rest of the world seemed to have disappeared. The stars were gone, the moon was hidden, and the mountains surrounding the road were swallowed by darkness. Jake stumbled to his feet, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. He turned back to the truck, but the cab was empty now. No sign of the woman, no trace of the mist. It was as if she had never been there. "Get it together, Jake," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "Just keep driving. Get off this damn road." He climbed back into the truck, slammed the door shut, and gripped the steering wheel with shaking hands. As he pressed on, the road seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the curves and turns repeating like a cruel, endless loop. The whispers returned, faint at first, then louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding him in a cacophony of disembodied voices. "Turn back," one voice hissed. "Stay with us," another urged. "You'll never leave," a chorus of voices chanted in unison. Jake slammed his fists against the steering wheel. "Shut up! Just shut up!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. The road ahead began to shift, the asphalt rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. The truck lurched violently as the tires struggled to grip the undulating surface. Jake's knuckles turned white as he fought to keep the vehicle steady. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't the woman this time. It was a man, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were old and tattered, his posture unnaturally rigid. Jake hit the brakes, but the truck skidded on the shifting asphalt, barreling straight toward the figure. At the last moment, the man stepped aside with an inhuman swiftness, disappearing into the fog. But something was wrong. The truck had stopped moving, yet the scenery outside continued to shift. The trees on either side of the road bent and twisted, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands reaching for him. The road itself seemed to spiral upward, twisting into an impossible incline that defied all logic. Jake felt the truck being pulled forward, as if an invisible force were dragging it against his will. The engine groaned in protest, the tires squealing as they struggled to grip the impossible surface. "No, no, no!" Jake shouted, slamming on the brakes. But the truck didn't stop. It continued to ascend the spiraling road, the gravitational pull growing stronger with each passing second. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied. They were inside the cab now, circling him like vultures around a dying animal. "You belong to us now. There's no escape. Join the lost." The truck reached the apex of the spiral, where the road abruptly ended. Beyond it was nothing but a yawning chasm of blackness, an abyss that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the truck teetered on the edge, the front tires dangling precariously over the void. He threw the gear shift into reverse, but the truck refused to move. Then, the woman appeared again. She was standing in the middle of the road, directly in front of the truck. Her face was no longer lifeless. It was filled with rage. Her eyes burned with an unnatural light, and her mouth twisted into a snarl. "You were warned," she said, her voice booming like thunder. "Now, you are ours." The truck lurched forward, pushed by an unseen force. Jake screamed as the vehicle tipped over the edge, plunging into the abyss. But the fall didn't end. Jake found himself suspended in darkness, the truck disintegrating around him. The whispers became deafening, the voices merging into a single monstrous roar. And then, silence. When Jake opened his eyes, he was back on the road. The truck was gone, and so was the fog. He was standing in the middle of the asphalt, the cold wind biting at his skin. But something was different. Jake turned to look behind him and saw himself. His own body, slumped over in the driver's seat of the truck, his eyes wide open and lifeless. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman's voice echoed in his mind. Welcome to the road of the lost. Jake was now a part of the whispers, a new voice added to the chorus that would haunt this cursed road for eternity. Jake's newfound existence as a phantom voice on the cursed road should have been the end of his story, but in the strange dimensions of the supernatural, endings often breed new beginnings. The oppressive darkness surrounding him began to take shape. Shadows stretched and warped, forming an endless corridor of cracked pavement, jagged trees, and faint outlines of other trapped souls. The whispers of the road no longer echoed as indistinct murmurs, but became painfully clear. "Why did you take that shortcut?" one voice cried, trembling with regret. "I just wanted to get home," sobbed another. "Will anyone remember me?" came a childlike plea, tinged with despair. Jake's essence floated aimlessly, caught between worlds, unable to scream, unable to speak. Yet he felt the pain of each voice like shards of glass piercing his being. He wasn't alone, but the company was far from comforting. The road stretched endlessly before him, lit by a dim and unnatural glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere. Figures emerged, shadowy silhouettes with faintly glowing eyes. They shuffled aimlessly, their faces contorted in silent screams. Some carried faint memories of their former selves, a woman clutching a faded photograph, a man dragging a rusted chain, a child holding a broken toy. Jake tried to move, but his form felt weightless and sluggish, like swimming through a viscous fog. He drifted forward, compelled by an unseen force, deeper into the Hall of Shadows. Then, he saw her again. The woman in the blood-stained dress stood at the far end of the corridor, her back turned to him. Her presence was commanding, the shadows around her bending and writhing as if drawn to her power. Jake felt an irresistible pull toward her, his essence dragged across the desolate expanse. As he neared, her voice pierced the silence. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her tone cold and unforgiving. Jake struggled to respond, but his spectral form could not produce sound. The woman turned slowly, her disfigured face illuminated by the faint glow. Her eyes burned with an otherworldly fire, and her twisted mouth curled into a cruel smile. "This road is a graveyard," she said, her voice echoing through the corridor. "A tomb for those who ignore the warnings, for those who think they can escape the consequences of their arrogance." Jake wanted to plead, to explain that he had no idea, that he hadn't meant any harm. But his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps behind him. He turned, or rather, his essence shifted, just in time to see a massive shadow looming over him. It was a figure unlike any he had seen before, towering and grotesque, its form constantly shifting as if made of swirling smoke. Its eyes glowed red, and its jagged mouth opened to release a guttural growl that sent shivers through Jake's entire being. The woman's voice rang out, calm yet commanding. "The keeper of the road," she said. "He ensures no one escapes." The keeper moved closer, its massive form blotting out the faint light. Jake felt an overwhelming pressure, as if his very essence were being crushed. The keeper reached out with a claw-like hand, and Jake braced himself for oblivion. But instead of destroying him, the keeper seized him and hurled him backward with unimaginable force. Jake's form was flung through the Hall of Shadows, past countless tortured souls and warped landscapes, until he slammed into a solid surface. When he regained his bearings, he realized he was back at the beginning of the road. Jake's spectral form hovered over the cracked asphalt. The air was thick with the same oppressive fog, and the twisted trees loomed like silent sentinels. The whispers had returned, faint and distant, as if mocking him. He watched in horror as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as a vehicle approached. It was his truck. Inside he saw himself, his living, breathing self, gripping the steering wheel, his face a mask of determination and annoyance. It was the moment he had ignored the locals' warnings and taken the shortcut. "No!" Jake screamed, though no sound escaped him. "Don't do it! Turn back!" But the living Jake couldn't hear him. The truck rumbled past his spectral form, vanishing into the fog. Jake was left alone once more, the crushing realization sinking in. He was trapped in an endless loop, forced to relive his mistake over and over again, powerless to change his fate. Time lost all meaning as Jake endured the cycle countless times, each repetition an agonizing reminder of his failure. He began to notice new details, the faint outlines of other spectral forms watching their own past selves, the subtle shifts in the whispers, the way the shadows seemed to tighten their grip with each passing loop. And then, one day, or perhaps one moment, in the timeless void, a new figure appeared. It was a young woman, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She stood at the edge of the road, clutching a map and glancing nervously at the fog. Jake realized she was about to make the same mistake he had. For the first time since his death, Jake felt a spark of determination. He didn't know how, but he had to stop her. As she stepped onto the road, Jake focused all his willpower, pushing against the invisible barriers that bound him. He felt resistance, like swimming against a powerful current, but he didn't stop. The woman paused, her eyes widening as a faint shape appeared before her. It was Jake, his spectral form flickering and barely visible, but enough to catch her attention. "Don't," Jake managed to whisper, his voice faint but audible. "Turn back." The woman hesitated, her fear evident. But before she could act, the shadows surged forward, engulfing her in darkness. Jake screamed in frustration as the keeper appeared once more, dragging her into the Hall of Shadows. Jake sank to the ground, defeated. He had tried, but it wasn't enough. The road claimed another victim. Years, or perhaps centuries, passed. Jake became one with the whispers, his voice joining the haunting chorus that filled the cursed road. But unlike the others, he held onto a shred of hope. One day, someone would listen. Someone would hear his warning and turn back. And when that day came, perhaps the road's curse would finally be broken. Until then, Jake remained on the road of the lost, a silent guardian trapped in an eternal nightmare. Story number 2. It was a late summer night when Sarah, Ethan, Max, and Leah decided to embark on their road trip across the country. The empty highway stretched before them like a silver ribbon beneath the glow of a waxing moon. The car's headlights pierced through the darkness, and the soft hum of the engine was the only sound that accompanied their laughter and casual conversation. The 4 friends had been planning this trip for months, a much-needed break from the hectic lives they each led. But they hadn't expected what was about to unfold. The night was unusually calm, almost unnervingly still. As they cruised down the deserted highway, Sarah noticed something in the distance, lights flickering like tiny stars on the horizon. At first, she thought it was just another car. But as they drew closer, her heart skipped a beat. The lights weren't from a single vehicle, it was a procession. A parade of vintage cars gliding down the highway in perfect formation. "Hey guys, look at that!" Sarah pointed out the window, her voice tinged with awe. "Are those old cars?" Ethan, the most skeptical of the group, squinted at the strange procession. The cars were impeccably restored, their chrome gleaming in the moonlight, but there was something unsettling about them. The cars had no drivers, their windows dark and empty. They moved in eerie silence, as though floating rather than driving. "Maybe it's some kind of show," Max suggested, his curiosity piqued. "A vintage car parade or something. But why is it out here in the middle of nowhere?" Leah, who had been silently staring out of the window, felt a chill crawl down her spine. The temperature in the car had dropped significantly. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "This doesn't feel right," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the windows. Despite the growing unease among them, Sarah, always the adventurous one, couldn't resist the temptation. "Come on, we have to check this out. It'll be cool." Max hesitated but shrugged, his sense of adventure outweighing his doubts. Ethan, however, felt a growing sense of dread. "I don't know about this. Something about those cars. It's like they're not real. Like they're ghosts." Ignoring his warning, Sarah urged Ethan to speed up. The caravan of vintage cars continued to glide ahead, their haunting parade uninterrupted by the passage of time. As they accelerated, the gap between them and the procession quickly closed. The headlights of their car cast a long, sharp beam across the dark road, illuminating the chrome details of the antique cars. Each car seemed to gleam like a relic from a past era, as if they had been preserved in time, immune to the ravages of age and decay. The air grew heavier, and the wind outside seemed to still, as though the world itself had taken a breath and was holding it. "Okay, I've had enough of this," Ethan muttered, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "We should turn back." But before anyone could reply, the highway in front of them began to change. The once straight path seemed to stretch endlessly, and the familiar curves of the road became a blur in the distance. The cars ahead of them, the antique caravan, seemed to vanish into the fog that suddenly enveloped the road. Thick, damp fog that swallowed the surroundings whole. The temperature dropped even further, and Leah felt her breath fog up in the air, despite the fact that the car's heater was on full blast. "Guys, what's happening?" Max asked, his voice shaky. "Where did the road go?" The fog thickened around them, and they could no longer see the cars they had been following. It was as if they had driven straight into another world. Sarah gripped the door handle, her heart racing. "This isn't right. I think we should turn back." But it was too late. The road ahead of them seemed to be endless. The once familiar highway now stretched out into a featureless expanse. a winding, unbroken path shrouded in fog. Every time Sarah tried to make a U-turn, the road twisted in such a way that it was impossible to retrace their steps. It felt like the road itself had turned against them. "We're lost," Leah said, her voice trembling with fear. This is insane." Ethan slammed his foot on the brake. "This isn't happening," he said under his breath, his eyes wide with panic. But when he looked ahead, the vintage cars had reappeared in the distance, their headlights gleaming with an eerie red glow. "Those cars are back," Max whispered. "But where are they going?" Without waiting for an answer, Sarah pushed the gas pedal, unwilling to let the mystery slip away. They had to follow the caravan. Maybe it was the only way out. The highway before them remained open, but it no longer felt like part of the world they knew. The world outside their car felt like a hollow void, the fog a thick, impenetrable barrier. Then, in the blink of an eye, the cars ahead of them turned sharply, vanishing into the mist once again. Leah's voice shook. "What's going on? How are they doing that?" Max, already on edge, couldn't take it anymore. "Maybe they're not real, maybe they're spirits or something. Maybe this road is cursed." "Stop!" Ethan snapped, his panic getting the best of him. "Don't say that. It's just fog, and our headlights are playing tricks. We just need to keep going." But something inside him was screaming for them to stop. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to turn back, to escape the nightmare unfolding on this desolate highway. Yet despite his growing dread, he couldn't bring himself to leave. They had to follow the caravan. One by one, the friends began to sense the reality shifting around them. It wasn't just the fog or the eerie procession of cars. It was something far darker, far more sinister. Leah was the first to feel it. The cold seeped into her bones and she shivered uncontrollably. "I can't feel my fingers," she muttered, glancing down at her hands. They were pale, almost translucent. The temperature inside the car plummeted, and she noticed that the breath she exhaled was visible, swirling in the air like smoke. Max tried to speak, but his words faltered. Something was wrong. Something terrible was happening, and no matter how fast they drove, the road kept changing, stretching, warping. "Do you see that?" Max asked, his voice barely audible. Ahead in the dense fog, he could make out the shadowy forms of people standing by the side of the road, figures dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces obscured by hoods or masks. And then, the first person disappeared. Ethan was the one who saw it. One moment, Leah was sitting in the front seat, her head resting against the window, looking out into the mist. The next, she was gone. The car door was open, and her seat was empty. "What the hell?" Ethan shouted, slamming on the brakes. Leah was gone. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest as he turned around in the driver's seat, eyes wide with disbelief. The empty seat beside him, where Leah had been just moments ago, now sat cold and vacant. The car door was ajar, the handle still swaying slightly as if it had just been pushed open. The fog outside had grown thicker, and he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. "Leah!" Sarah screamed, her voice high with panic. She leaned over the center console, her eyes frantic. "Leah, where are you?" Max's eyes darted around the car. "She was just here. She was right next to us." Ethan could barely form words. His mind raced, unable to process what had just happened. 1 minute, Leah had been there, frozen in the chill, her breath clouding the air, and now she was gone without a trace. "She didn't even get out of the car," Max whispered, his voice trembling. "How could she have just disappeared like that?" Sarah was hyperventilating. "We need to find her. We can't just leave her out there. It's too dangerous." But as she spoke, a faint sound reached their ears. It was soft at first, a distant, echoing hum. The sound of an old, scratchy radio, playing an eerie tune that seemed to come from nowhere, swirling through the thick fog. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. The sound was coming from somewhere nearby, but they couldn't tell where. "Did anyone hear that?" Ethan asked, his voice low and strained. Max nodded. "Yeah. What is that?" "It's creepy as hell." Sarah stared at the rearview mirror, eyes wide. The lights are coming closer. The caravan. It's back." Ethan looked behind him, and his breath caught in his throat. The vintage cars were reappearing, their headlights glowing a fiery red, their headlights like demonic eyes staring back at them from the fog. But this time, the cars were moving faster. They weren't floating or gliding anymore. They were speeding down the road with an unnatural swiftness, and they were heading straight toward them. "We need to get out of here," Ethan shouted, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The car jerked forward, the tires screeching as he tried to outrun the phantom caravan, but it was no use. The more he tried to speed away, the more the road seemed to stretch on without end. The fog was closing in, thick and suffocating, obscuring everything beyond their headlights. Each time they thought they saw the road ahead, it twisted in on itself, forming endless loops that brought them right back to the same spot. The noise from the vintage cars was getting louder. A chorus of eerie, dissonant music played from somewhere inside the fog, accompanied by the screech of old, rusted brakes and the grinding of gears. It was like the very air had turned into a symphony of torment, each note a warning. Max reached for the door handle, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I can't do this anymore. We need to leave, now." Ethan's hands were shaking as he gripped the wheel. "I don't know where we're going, Max. The road is changing. It's like we're trapped in a nightmare." Just as he spoke, a loud bang echoed from the back of the car, followed by a screeching sound as if something was scraping against metal. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, but this time there was something else. A figure was standing in the fog behind them. A tall, slender figure dressed in a long coat, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The figure was walking toward them, slowly, purposefully. "Who's that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I don't know. I don't care. Just keep your head down." But before they could react, the figure raised their hand, and the fog parted for a brief moment, revealing a large, dilapidated car. It was like no other car they had seen before. It was older, rusted, and covered in layers of grime and decay. The headlights of the car were glowing a faint red, casting an eerie light across the scene. The vintage caravan had vanished for a moment, but the presence of this car seemed even more foreboding. Suddenly, the figure disappeared back into the fog, vanishing without a trace. Ethan slammed his foot on the brake, skidding to a halt. The car jerked to a stop just as they approached the abandoned vehicle. The music from the fog grew louder, now a distorted melody that felt like it was coming from every direction. "We can't stay here," Max muttered, voice trembling. "We need to go. We need to get out of here before we end up like..." His words trailed off as the car's headlights fell upon something in the front seat of the abandoned car. A picture. It was a photograph, old and yellowed, wedged into the crack of the seat. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat as he caught a glimpse of the people in the photograph. It was a picture of them, Sarah, Max, Leah, and himself, standing together with the vintage cars in the background. Their faces were smiling, but there was something wrong about it. The cars in the background, although beautiful, had an unnatural quality to them. The headlights seemed to glow even in the photograph, like burning eyes. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. That's us. How is that even possible?" Ethan reached for the photo, his hands trembling as he picked it up. His fingers brushed against the aged paper, and in that moment, he felt a deep, icy chill sweep through him. He looked closer. The edges of the photo were worn, and the image of the caravan was blurred, like it had been taken from an impossibly long distance. "Look at the date," Max said, his voice tight with fear. "It's from tonight." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. There was no way. They had only just encountered the caravan a few minutes ago, but the photo showed them with the same caravan behind them. It was impossible. He looked up from the photograph, panic rising in his chest. "We're not just on some creepy road trip, are we? This place is cursed." A low growl echoed from the distance, deep and guttural. The red headlights of the phantom caravan reappeared through the fog, and this time, they weren't alone. More cars emerged, their headlights gleaming like fiery eyes in the night. The last survivor's scream echoed through the endless highway as the caravan surged forward, its wheels spinning on the pavement like demonic shadows. And then, nothing. The atmosphere grew colder, the air pressing down on them like a heavy weight. Ethan's mind was spinning, a chaotic whirl of disbelief and terror. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the photograph in his hands, the twisted image of themselves standing by the caravan, a haunting reminder that whatever this was, it wasn't natural. They had crossed into something beyond their understanding. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, her breath shallow. "Why are we seeing this? How is this even possible?" Ethan couldn't answer. His mouth was dry, his mind struggling to form coherent thoughts. He looked up at the windshield, where the fog had thickened even further, wrapping around the car like a suffocating cloak. The low hum of the phantom caravan filled the air, a dissonant, ghostly sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Max's eyes flicked nervously from the rearview mirror to the side windows. "We're not alone here, are we?" he muttered, his voice quivering with fear. "That thing, that car, it's watching us." Sarah turned to look behind them, her face pale as she gripped the seat with both hands. "I don't know if I can take much more of this," she said, voice cracking. "I just want to go home. I want to leave this place." Ethan tried to keep his voice steady. "We need to stay calm. We can't panic. We need to figure out how to get out of here." But it was becoming increasingly clear that staying calm wasn't an option. The phantom caravan was closing in on them, its spectral presence like a looming shadow. The sound of the engines revving, the squeal of tires on asphalt, it was all so real, yet so impossible. Ethan's heart raced in his chest, each thumping beat matching the rhythm of the music from the fog. The once empty stretch of highway now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, like the road itself was alive. Suddenly, the fog parted for a moment, revealing a glimpse of what lay ahead. A massive archway in the distance, a gateway carved from weathered stone. The archway was covered in thick vines, the stone chipped and worn with age. There were strange symbols etched into its surface, symbols that seemed to shimmer and shift as they looked at them. "What is that?" Max asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan squinted, his eyes trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "I don't know, but it looks like some kind of entrance." The sound of the phantom caravan grew louder, now accompanied by the ghostly laughter of unseen figures, a mocking and eerie sound that made their blood run cold. "It's getting closer," Sarah gasped. "What should we do? We can't just stay here." Ethan's mind raced. They had to get to the archway. Maybe it was some kind of way out. The road behind them was now a blur of headlights, red and angry, like the eyes of demons chasing them. The vehicles in the caravan weren't just cars anymore. They were like monstrous apparitions, their forms flickering in and out of existence, as if they were being pulled from some otherworldly dimension. "We can't outrun them," Ethan muttered, "but maybe we can lose them in that arch. If it's some kind of portal, maybe it'll lead us out of here." Without waiting for any objections, he slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The car surged forward, the engine roaring to life. The tires screeched against the wet asphalt as the car shot down the highway toward the archway. As they sped forward, the fog began to close in again, thick and suffocating. The headlights of the caravan followed them, their glow a hellish red, illuminating the road behind them like the eyes of a relentless predator. "We're not going to make it," Max shouted, his voice laced with panic. "They're right behind us." Ethan gritted his teeth, the archway growing closer with each passing second. The road ahead seemed to stretch out longer, almost impossibly so. But they had no choice but to press forward. He could hear the faint screeching of the phantom cars, as if the very air was warping around them. The archway loomed larger, the symbols on its surface glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. It seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he saw a shadow move within the archway, a figure standing just beyond its threshold. It was a tall, slender figure, much like the one they had seen earlier, but this time its face was visible, a pale, lifeless face with hollow eyes, staring at them as if it were waiting. "Go!" Sarah screamed, her voice tight with fear. "Go now!" Ethan slammed his foot down harder, the car hurtling toward the archway at full speed. The figure moved aside, allowing them to pass through. As they drove through the archway, everything seemed to shift. The fog lifted, and the road ahead became clearer. The sounds of the phantom cars, the ghostly music, and the laughter faded into nothingness. The air grew warmer, less oppressive. They had passed through. But the relief was short-lived. Ahead, the road had changed completely. No longer was it the dark, deserted highway they had been on for so long. Now, it was a strange, desolate stretch of land, barren and lifeless. The landscape was flat, with cracked earth stretching to the horizon. There were no signs of life, no vegetation, no light, just the overwhelming silence that settled over them. "Where are we?" Max whispered, looking around in confusion. "What is this place?" Ethan swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know, but I think we're not supposed to be here." Just then, a low rumble echoed from the distance, like thunder rolling across a stormy sky. The ground trembled beneath them, and they could feel the car vibrating as if the very earth was alive, responding to something unseen. "Get out!" Sarah shouted, her voice filled with terror. "We need to get out of here now." Ethan barely had time to react before the car's headlights flickered, then went dark. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them in complete darkness. "Damn it!" Ethan cursed, trying to restart the car, but it wouldn't turn over. Come on, come on." And then a voice, a cold, hollow voice, echoed across the desolate landscape, carrying on the wind. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan froze. The voice was low and menacing, a whisper that seemed to crawl under his skin, freezing him with fear. The ground trembled again, this time more violently. Figures began to materialize in the distance, figures moving toward them from the barren horizon. They were tall, pale, and shadowy, their faces obscured by hoods or masks, their forms shifting and flickering as though they were not fully present in this world. There was no escape. The figure from the archway had followed them through, and now they were surrounded. The last survivor's breath hitched in their throat as the shadows closed in, and the ghostly laughter of the caravan echoed once more, deafening and unrelenting. The oppressive silence in the air seemed to suffocate Ethan. The figures that had appeared on the barren landscape were slowly advancing toward them, their forms flickering in and out of existence, as if they were not fully part of this world. The cold, hollow voice that had spoken still echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder of how far they had crossed into the unknown. "Who are they?" Max whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Ethan didn't answer at first. He could barely comprehend what was happening, let alone understand the nature of the figures that were now surrounding them. They were tall, unnaturally so, their limbs long and distorted, moving with a fluid grace that made them seem almost otherworldly. Their faces were hidden beneath tattered cloaks or masks, and their eyes, if they had any, were black voids, empty and infinite. One of the figures, the tallest among them, stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It was as if it were savoring the fear it instilled in them. The air around it seemed to shimmer, warping and distorting like a heat wave rising off the ground. "Who are you?" Ethan managed to croak, his throat dry, his voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, its presence sending a cold shiver down Ethan's spine. It spoke, the voice coming from within its very being, resonating deep inside their minds. "We are the keepers of the road, the ones who govern the passage between worlds." Max's breath caught in his throat. "Worlds? What do you mean? What are you talking about?" The figure's hollow eyes seemed to bore into Max, the air around them growing colder. "You have crossed the boundary. You have followed the caravan, and now you are ours." Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. He turned to Sarah, but her face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't speak, but he could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that they were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. "We didn't mean to," Ethan said, trying to reason, his voice wavering. "We didn't know. We just saw the cars and we followed. We didn't know it was a trap." The figure raised its hand. A long, skeletal finger pointed toward the horizon. "The road calls to the lost. Those who seek what they do not understand are drawn into the fog, and once you enter, you do not leave. You belong to us now." Ethan's heart raced, panic rising in his chest. The fog, the endless road, this place, it was all connected. They had made a terrible mistake, and now it was too late. The realization hit him hard. The caravan, the ghostly cars, the disappearing friends, it had all been part of the same horrifying trap. "Please," Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. "We just want to go home. We didn't mean to get involved in this." The figure's hollow eyes glinted as it moved closer, its presence suffocating. "You cannot go home. The road does not let you leave. Once you have followed the caravan, your fate is sealed." Suddenly, there was a loud, deafening crash. The ground beneath them trembled violently, and the car, their only means of escape, shuddered, its metal frame groaning under the pressure. The headlights flickered erratically, then died completely, plunging them into darkness. Ethan reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, the figures surrounded the car, their shadowy forms closing in from all directions. He could hear the sound of their footsteps on the cracked earth, a soft, rhythmic thudding that seemed to echo in his bones. Then, from the distance, there was a sound that made their blood run cold, the low, mournful cry of an engine, followed by the screeching tires of an old car. The caravan had returned. Through the thick fog, the headlights of the vintage cars appeared, their demonic red glow piercing through the haze. The phantom vehicles, once distant, were now right in front of them, their forms emerging like monsters from the shadows. There was no escape, no way out. The caravan was closing in on them. A loud bang echoed from outside the car. One of the figures had slammed its fist against the window, and Ethan could feel the vibration of the impact through the entire vehicle. He jerked backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The figures were moving faster now, their movements jerky, like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. The sound of the phantom cars grew louder, their engines roaring in unison, a terrifying symphony of destruction. "Get out!" Max shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. "We have to run!" But Ethan was paralyzed. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. He couldn't think, couldn't move. All he could hear was the sound of the engines, the low growl of the cars, the laughter, the screams that seemed to come from every direction. The fog thickened around them, and the figures closed in, their faces now visible in the dim light of the headlights. Their eyes were empty voids, black as the night itself. There was no pity, no mercy in their gaze, only cold, unfeeling hunger. Suddenly, a figure leaned down to the window, its face inches from Ethan's. Its eyes glowed faintly, like the embers of a dying fire. "You should have turned back," it whispered, its voice cold and cruel. "Now you will join the others." The ground shook again, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. Ethan gasped, his chest tightening. The figures were pulling him toward them, their long fingers stretching out to grasp him. "No!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Please, no!" But it was too late. The figures surrounded the car completely, their hands gripping the doors, pulling at the windows. Ethan tried to resist, but it was no use. The car began to lift off the ground, hovering, as if it were being sucked into the air by an unseen force. Max and Sarah screamed in terror, but their voices were swallowed by the growing roar of the phantom cars. The world around them seemed to warp, bending and twisting as the air crackled with energy. The figures slowly dragged them out of the car, their cold fingers pulling at their clothes, their skin. Ethan tried to hold on to the seat, but it was futile. As the last shred of resistance faded, Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest. He gasped for breath, but his vision blurred. The figures' faces were now inches from his own, their cold, empty eyes locking onto his. He was being pulled into the fog, into the caravan's clutches. Everything went black. Ethan awoke with a sudden gasp, his body jerking upright as if he had been yanked from the abyss. His heart was pounding, his breaths ragged and shallow. But as his eyes slowly adjusted to the surroundings, confusion set in. He wasn't in the car anymore. He wasn't anywhere he recognized. The ground beneath him was dry, cracked, and uneven. The sky above was dark, but not in the way night should be. It was an unnatural, inky blackness that seemed to stretch on forever, as if it was an empty canvas waiting for something to fill it. The air was still and heavy, as though the very atmosphere had grown thick with malice. A faint, distant hum filled the air, like the sound of an engine idling, but it was too far to pinpoint its source. He tried to move, but his body felt sluggish, as though something was weighing him down. He raised his hands to his face, and they trembled as they made contact with his skin. His fingers were ice cold, his body drenched in a clammy sweat. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he looked around in desperation. There was no sign of Max or Sarah, no sign of anything familiar. The road stretched out before him, winding endlessly into the void. The world felt endless, but utterly lifeless, as if it were a place frozen in time, disconnected from everything he knew. "What? Where am I?" he murmured to himself, his voice hoarse. He slowly stood, his legs unsteady, his mind still reeling from the terrifying events that had unfolded. The figures, the fog, the phantom cars, had it all been a nightmare? He didn't know, but it didn't feel like a dream. It felt real. The terror, the coldness, the oppressive weight pressing down on him. It was all too vivid. Ethan turned around, hoping for some sign of familiarity, but there was nothing. Just the barren, endless expanse of the road and the unnatural darkness surrounding him. He stumbled forward, each step heavy with dread. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back, but he had no idea where to go or what direction would even lead him out of this nightmare. The road was all that lay before him, its surface cracked and uneven, stretching into an abyss that seemed to lead nowhere. "Max!" "Sarah," he called out, his voice trembling. His words echoed back at him, but there was no answer, no sign of life. As he walked, his eyes scanned the horizon for any movement. The fog had dissipated, but the silence remained, suffocating. A soft, distant sound reached his ears, a faint, melodic tune, like music drifting through the air. It was slow, haunting, and somehow familiar. Ethan's footsteps faltered. It was the same strange music he had heard before, when the first friend had vanished. The music had come from the fog, calling them forward, luring them deeper into the trap. He had to find out what was happening. He had to find Sarah and Max. But as he moved forward, the eerie tune became louder, its rhythm picking up pace, almost like a heartbeat. The melody wrapped around him, filling his mind, urging him to keep moving, to follow it. Something wasn't right. He reached into his pocket, his fingers trembling as he pulled out his phone. The screen flickered to life, and he saw that there was no signal, no service, nothing. He cursed under his breath, shoving the phone back into his pocket. The isolation weighed on him, and the feeling of being utterly disconnected from everything he knew was overwhelming. The distant music continued to play, pulling him deeper into the darkness. Then, as if summoned by his thoughts, the first of the phantom cars appeared on the horizon, slowly drifting toward him. Its headlights shone through the mist like eyes staring into his soul. The old vehicle, a vintage car with peeling paint and rusted chrome, was coming from the same direction that the music had been emanating from. The sound of its engine was soft at first, but it grew louder as it neared. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He wanted to turn and run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. The car was moving at a slow, deliberate pace, and its headlights were locked on him. Then, without warning, the car came to a halt in front of him. The engine idled, the eerie hum filling the air once more. The doors of the car creaked open, and the faint silhouette of a figure stepped out. It was the same kind of figure that had surrounded the car earlier, the tall, elongated form, cloaked in shadows. Its face was hidden behind a mask, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Do not resist," the figure's voice echoed in Ethan's mind, the words chilling and distant. "You are already lost." Ethan's body trembled as the figure stepped closer. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his limbs wouldn't obey. He was trapped in the grip of something far beyond his understanding. "You belong to the road now," the figure continued, its voice now a low, whispering hum. "The caravan has claimed you. There is no return. There is only the endless journey, the eternal road that leads to nowhere." Ethan's thoughts raced, his mind struggling to piece together what was happening. The caravan, the spectral cars. What did it all mean? And why were they targeting him? Why him and his friends? The figure raised a hand, its skeletal fingers reaching out to him. For the first time, Ethan saw its eyes, the black voids, empty and endless, like holes in the fabric of reality itself. The figure's gaze locked onto his, and suddenly, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of despair flood his chest. A sharp pain shot through his head, as though his very thoughts were being pulled from him. His body trembled as the darkness around him seemed to close in, suffocating, consuming. "Join us," the figure whispered. Ethan's vision blurred. His mind was swirling with thoughts that weren't his own, images of endless roads, of the caravan, of all those who had disappeared before him. He saw Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, as she too was swallowed by the fog, lost to the endless journey. He saw Max, staring blankly at the dashboard, his skin cold and lifeless, just as the first friend had been. They were all trapped here, on this cursed highway, caught in a never-ending cycle. "Join us," the figure repeated, its voice like the final breath of someone lost to time. Ethan's body trembled, his will weakening. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees, staring up at the figure that loomed over him. His vision darkened, the edges of his sight beginning to fade. And then, just before everything went black, a single thought pierced through the fog of his mind. He wasn't alone. Ethan's body hit the ground with a sickening thud, his vision fading as the darkness took him. The last vestiges of his consciousness seemed to slip away, and with it, the crushing despair of being utterly lost. But somewhere deep in his mind, a spark of defiance remained. He wasn't ready to surrender to this eternal nightmare, not yet. In the darkness, something stirred. It was faint at first, like the flicker of a dying candle trying to hold on to its last breath. Ethan's thoughts grew muddled, but then, in the recesses of his mind, an image emerged, a memory of Sarah and Max, smiling at him in the sunlight. A fragment of who they once were, full of life and hope. The image became sharper, clearer, as if it were calling to him, pulling him back. "Come back," a voice whispered. This time, a voice full of warmth and hope. It wasn't the cold, hollow whisper of the figure, but something much more familiar. It was Sarah's voice, soft but urgent. Ethan's eyes fluttered open. The darkness was still there, but it was different now. Less suffocating, less oppressive. He could feel his body again, solid and whole, though heavy with exhaustion. He forced himself to sit up, his breath shallow and labored. The figure was gone. Ethan's heart raced as he scanned his surroundings. The desolate highway stretched before him, but there was something different about it now. The oppressive fog was gone, replaced by a faint light in the distance, a warm golden glow. Unlike anything he had seen in this strange, haunted place, the hum of the phantom engines had faded too, leaving only a soft, melodic sound. It was the same haunting tune he had heard earlier, but now it sounded less sinister. It was distant but gentle, almost like a lullaby. "Sarah? Max?" Ethan called, his voice hoarse but filled with newfound determination. And then, like a miracle, a shadow appeared on the horizon, a figure emerging from the light, walking towards him. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, but her eyes were alive, filled with the warmth and recognition he had been longing for. She was real. She was here. "Ethan," Sarah whispered, her voice full of relief. "I knew you would find us." Max was beside her, his expression equally relieved, though his eyes were full of sadness. How did you find me?" Ethan asked, struggling to stand. "We never left," Sarah said, offering him her hand. "This place, it's a trap, but it doesn't have to claim us. We just have to choose to leave." Ethan stared at her hand, then looked down at the ground. The thought of staying, of giving in to the endless cycle, was tempting. The road, the fog, the ghostly figures, they had all wanted to keep him, to trap him in their world. But now, surrounded by Sarah and Max, Ethan realized that this place had no power over them. Not anymore. A wave of understanding washed over him. The road was endless because the people who had fallen into its trap had never truly believed they could escape. But Ethan and his friends had found each other again. There was power in that connection, in the bond of friendship, in the refusal to give up. With a deep breath, Ethan grabbed Sarah's hand. Max stepped forward and clapped him on the back, a small smile crossing his face. "Let's go," Max said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Together, the three of them began walking toward the glowing light in the distance. The road before them no longer seemed endless. With each step, the darkness retreated, replaced by warmth and hope. The fog was gone. The strange music faded away, and the specter of the caravan, with its ghostly figures and cursed vehicles, was nothing more than a memory. The closer they walked to the light, the more real the world around them became. The dry, cracked earth gave way to soft grass beneath their feet. The inky sky lightened into a soft blue, and the air, once thick with dread, became fresh and invigorating. Finally, they reached the light, and as they stepped through it, the world around them shifted. They were no longer on the deserted highway. They were back in the real world, in the quiet, peaceful night they had left behind. Ethan took a deep breath, looking around in awe. The stars twinkled above them, and the familiar sound of crickets filled the air. He turned to Sarah and Max, their faces mirroring his own sense of disbelief. We made it," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled, her eyes full of tears. "We never stopped believing." Max grinned. "I told you we'd get out of this mess." The three of them embraced, the bond of friendship stronger than ever. They had faced unimaginable horrors together, and in the end, it was their unity that had freed them. The caravan had vanished, and with it, the curse of the endless highway. They were free. But deep inside, Ethan knew they would never forget the terror they had faced. The highway, The phantom cars, the ghostly figures, they would haunt their dreams. And perhaps, if they ever traveled alone again, the memory of the caravan would still linger in the back of their minds. But they had survived. And in the end, that was enough. The three friends walked into the night, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it together, forever bonded by the terror they had escaped. Story number 3. The night air was cool, and the engine of Ethan Richardson's car hummed steadily beneath him as he cruised down the long, winding rural road. A soft breeze rolled in through his cracked window, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. The highway, poorly lit and often deserted, seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He had just finished a long day of work and was anxious to get home. But tonight, there was something peculiar in the air, something he couldn't quite place, though he refused to admit it to himself. The journey was routine, the kind of drive Ethan had made countless times before. The night sky, clear and unmarred by clouds, stretched out above him, its stars twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet blanket. The headlights of his old sedan cut through the darkness, illuminating the fog that clung to the road's surface in ghostly tendrils. Despite the beauty of the scene, the fog seemed out of place, as if it had appeared too suddenly and with too much thickness for a night that had seemed clear just hours earlier. Ethan yawned as he adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to keep himself alert. His eyes drifted to the trees on either side of the road, tall and imposing, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The woods had always seemed to beckon in a strange way, as though the dark forest itself was hiding secrets that he dared not uncover. But the road was familiar, and he had nothing to fear. As he continued driving, he noticed the temperature seemed to drop, though the weather didn't seem to have changed. The cool breeze from the window had turned sharper, biting at his skin as it flowed through the car. Ethan rolled up the window, trying to dismiss the nagging discomfort that slowly crept over him. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past midnight. His eyes grew heavy, his eyelids fluttering as the monotonous rhythm of the road began to lull him into a sleepy trance. The car's tires rolled over the asphalt in steady succession, a rhythm so familiar that his mind began to wander. Thoughts of his day, his work, his plans for the weekend, all mingled together, a haze of forgettable details. But then something caught his eye. At first, it was just a fleeting shadow by the side of the road, just beyond the reach of his headlights. His gaze snapped to the left, heart skipping a beat, but all he could see was the faint outline of something, no, someone, standing by the roadside. His foot pressed instinctively against the brake, but he was going too fast. In the dim light, he could barely make out a figure, a woman. Her face, pale and ghostly, was the only feature he could discern, the rest of her body obscured by the darkness. She was standing in a patch of trees, her form barely visible, except for the pale glow of her face as it was briefly illuminated by his headlights. Ethan's mind raced. He thought of the urban legends his grandfather used to tell him. Strange figures on dark roads, hitchhikers who were never really there. He had heard of people who picked up such figures, only for them to vanish without a trace. But that was just a story, right? Still, the sight of her sent an unfamiliar chill down his spine. He had heard strange things about this road. Rumors, whispers, stories of people seeing things they shouldn't, of driving through strange occurrences that they couldn't explain. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything that couldn't be explained by science. Yet something about her, standing there in the middle of nowhere, felt wrong. As he passed her, the thought crossed his mind. Should I stop? Should I offer her a ride? But something told him it was a bad idea, that maybe he shouldn't be involved. After all, it was late, and this road was known for its strange stories. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, making the car surge forward. eager to put some distance between himself and the unsettling figure. But the moment he passed her, something strange happened. His rearview mirror caught a glimpse of movement. The woman was no longer standing by the road. She was sitting in the back seat of his car. Ethan's blood ran cold. His heart raced in his chest as his mind scrambled to process the impossible. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. He hadn't heard the door open. He hadn't heard footsteps behind him. He hadn't even felt the air change. And yet, there she was, her pale face turned toward him in the mirror, her eyes wide and unblinking. She looked emotionless, like she had always been there, like she had never been standing outside. He whipped his head around, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breath caught in his throat. The back seat was empty. The woman was gone. The only thing visible was the faded upholstery of his old sedan. For a moment, Ethan just stared, his mind spinning with disbelief. His breath came in ragged gasps as his heart pounded in his chest. He quickly glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the empty back seat, his hands shaking as they gripped the wheel. Nothing. The car was empty. It's nothing, he told himself. I must be imagining things, just a trick of the mind. But even as the rational part of his brain tried to make sense of it, the unease in his stomach refused to go away. He tried to dismiss it, to convince himself that his mind was playing tricks on him, but it was impossible to ignore the fear gnawing at his insides. His hands were clammy on the wheel, and his mouth was dry. The air inside the car felt colder now, though the night around him was still warm. The fog, thick as ever, continued to roll across the road, and the trees, now barely visible in the distance, loomed like dark sentinels watching him. Ethan's gaze kept flicking to the rearview mirror. He couldn't stop himself. He expected to see her there again, but she wasn't. Or was she? Every time he glanced back, he half expected her to reappear, but each time, the back seat remained empty. "Get a grip," he scolded himself. "You're just tired. It's nothing. There's no one here." But as the miles passed, the feeling of being watched, of something not being right, only grew stronger. Ethan glanced at the clock on the dashboard again. He was close to home now, just a few more miles, and he would be out of this cursed stretch of road. And yet, despite his rational mind telling him to keep driving, to get to safety, he felt an undeniable urge to look back once more. He did. And for just a fleeting second, the pale face of the woman was there again. But this time, her eyes weren't staring at him. They were looking at the empty front seat. The next few miles felt like an eternity. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as the unease from his encounter with the woman lingered, like a dark shadow that refused to let go. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, in the back seat, watching him. Each time he glanced in the rearview mirror, he half expected her pale face to be there, her eyes staring at him with cold, unblinking intensity. But as the minutes ticked by, the mirror remained empty. He let out a sigh of relief, though it was strained and shallow, as if the weight of the encounter still hung over him. He had to admit, even to himself, that something wasn't right. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to. The rational part of his mind told him that it was just a strange trick of the light, or perhaps the result of his own fatigue. He was tired, after all. A long day at work, followed by a late-night drive on an unfamiliar stretch of road. But another part of him couldn't dismiss it entirely. That feeling, that overwhelming sense of dread, wouldn't go away. Finally, the familiar sights of his neighborhood began to appear in the distance. The winding roads, the homes with their warm porch lights glowing in the dark, the street lamps casting their soft yellow light. These were the things that reassured him, that made him feel safe. He had made it through the worst of it. His house was only a few more blocks away. He turned the corner onto his street, the tires of his car crunching on the gravel driveway as he pulled up to the front of his house. The familiar sight of his small one-story home, with its white picket fence and overgrown garden, provided a sense of comfort. Home. Safe. He shut off the engine, the silence of the night suddenly deafening in his ears. The headlights flickered off, and the darkness enveloped him, making the world outside his car seem distant and far away. Ethan hesitated before opening the door, a strange reluctance preventing him from stepping out. He glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. Nothing. It's over, Ethan, he told himself. She's gone. You're home. Everything is fine. But as he opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel, the chill in the air wrapped around him like an invisible hand. He glanced around, the stillness of the night amplifying every tiny sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the faint hum of streetlights. But then something caught his eye. There, on the ground in front of his car, were muddy footprints, fresh ones. They led from the front of his car all the way to his doorstep, as though someone had walked up to his house. Ethan froze, his blood running cold as he stared at the muddy prints. He was certain he hadn't seen them when he parked. The ground was dry, the night had been clear, and there had been no sign of anyone near his car when he arrived. But now, the footprints were unmistakable, imprinted deep into the gravel, as though someone had stepped out of the fog and walked right to his door. His heart thudded in his chest as he followed the prints, his every step heavy with dread. The trail led to his front door where the muddy marks stopped. But that wasn't what made his skin crawl. It was the faint impressions in the mud, two distinct, shallow indentations that looked as though someone had been standing there, just outside his door watching. His breath caught in his throat. She followed me home. Ethan's mind raced, a mix of fear and disbelief coursing through him. He turned back to the car, his eyes scanning the empty driveway, expecting to see something, or someone, waiting for him. But the night was still, quiet, empty. Swallowing hard, he slowly approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the whisper of the wind in the trees sounding almost like a warning. When he opened the door and stepped inside, the silence of the house greeted him like an old friend. But it felt different now, unfamiliar. A heavy air seemed to hang in the hall, as though something had shifted while he was gone. He locked the door behind him and leaned against it, trying to calm his racing heart. Just get inside, he told himself. It's fine. She's not here. There's no one following you. But even as he tried to rationalize, the unease clung to him like a second skin. His mind wandered back to the woman, the strange figure he had seen on the roadside. He had passed her, sped past her, thinking it would be over. But now it seemed as if she had somehow made her way into his life, following him, haunting him. Shaking his head, he tried to dismiss it. He was just tired. It had been a long night, but as he walked deeper into the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter, and that's when he heard it. The faint sound of whispers, barely audible but unmistakable. His heart leapt in his chest and he froze, straining to listen. The whispers were soft, almost like a murmur, but they seemed to come from somewhere near the window. His body tensed as his eyes darted toward the source of the sound. Cautiously, he walked toward the living room, each step slow and deliberate. The whispers grew louder as he approached the window. It was almost as if they were beckoning him, urging him to look outside. When he reached the window, he hesitated. He didn't want to see anything, didn't want to look out there, but the curiosity gnawed at him. His fingers gripped the edge of the blinds, and with a deep breath, he pulled them aside. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, outside his window, standing beneath the dim street lamp in his front yard, was the woman. Her pale face glowed eerily in the darkness, and her eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, were staring directly at him. The whispers stopped. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then, as if on cue, she smiled. But it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was a twisted, jagged grin, like something out of a nightmare. Her face was distorted, her features contorted in a grotesque way, as if the human shape of her had been twisted into something unnatural. The faintest glow emanated from her eyes, a sickly, unnatural light. Ethan stepped back from the window, his legs unsteady beneath him. He didn't know how long he stood there, frozen, staring at her. But the moment he turned his gaze away, just for a second, she was gone. He rushed to the door and bolted it shut, his hands shaking uncontrollably. What is happening? He thought, his mind racing. Then the phone rang. The sudden shrill of the phone made him jump, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced at the caller ID. There was no name, just an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling. For a moment there was only silence, and then the voice came, soft, breathy, and unmistakable. "Ethan, you should have picked me up." The line went dead. Ethan dropped the phone in horror. His mind raced, every thought jumbled and tangled. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the curse had already begun. The days that followed felt like a blur to Ethan, each moment stretching and distorting, as if the world itself had been bent out of shape. He tried to go about his daily routine, tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but deep down, he knew he was being watched. The whispers, the cold sensation that had settled into the corners of his house, the unsettling feeling that every shadow held something sinister. Everything had changed. Sleep had become a rare and precious commodity. Ethan would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, the unsettling image of the woman's twisted smile haunting his every thought. When he did manage to fall asleep, he would wake with a start, drenched in sweat, the sound of whispers ringing in his ears, his heart racing. The worst part was the constant sense of presence. It was as if she was always near, lurking just beyond the periphery of his vision, waiting to make herself known. He'd catch glimpses of her silhouette in the reflection of a window, or see her shadow darting just out of view. And when he looked directly, she was gone. The madness crept in slowly at first, like a trickle of water seeping through the cracks. But soon, it was like an avalanche, a force he couldn't stop, an oppressive weight that crushed him under its intensity. Ethan had become a shell of himself. He couldn't eat, he couldn't focus, and he certainly couldn't sleep. His work, once a source of pride and accomplishment, now seemed irrelevant, like the final remains of a life that was no longer his own. He barely made it through the day, his body on autopilot as his mind spiraled further into madness. And then, one evening, it happened again. He was sitting in his living room, trying to distract himself with a movie, but the flickering images on the screen couldn't hold his attention. His mind kept drifting back to her, the woman, the phantom, the curse that had taken hold of his life. He could feel her presence again, close, too close, like a cold breath on the back of his neck. The wind outside had picked up, the trees swaying ominously in the darkened yard. The house creaked under the pressure of the storm, and the shadows seemed to dance on the walls in strange, twisted patterns. Ethan tried to ignore the gnawing sense of dread in his chest, but it was impossible. It felt like something terrible was about to happen. Then, just as his nerves reached their breaking point, the doorbell rang. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m. No one came to visit at this hour, not in the middle of a storm. Who could it be? His first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't heard. But then he remembered. The footprints, the whispers, the woman, all of it had led him here, to this moment. And something deep inside him told him that he couldn't escape it anymore, that this was it, the moment of reckoning. Slowly he stood up, his legs shaking as he made his way to the door. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his breath shallow. his pulse pounding in his ears. Should I open it? Should I face whatever is on the other side? Before he could decide, the doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. He jumped at the sound, his skin prickling with a cold sweat. With a deep, shuddering breath, he finally turned the knob. The door creaked open. For a moment, there was only darkness. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees, but the porch was empty. No one stood there, nothing moved. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He was about to close the door, about to convince himself it was nothing, when he heard it. The soft, eerie whisper of her voice, coming from behind him. "Let me in, Ethan." His body went rigid, his blood running cold. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach like a lead weight. There she was. The woman stood in the doorway, her disfigured face illuminated by the flickering light from the porch. Her pale, ghostly features seemed even more twisted up close, as if her very existence was a cruel mockery of life itself. Her eyes glowed faintly, burning with an unnatural light as they locked onto him. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He wanted to run, to get as far away from her as possible, but his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen in place, as if some invisible force was holding him captive. And then she spoke again, her voice low and chilling. "You should have picked me up, Ethan. Now you'll never be free." In that moment, Ethan knew that there was no escaping her. No hiding, no running, no bargaining. The curse had already taken root, and it wasn't going to let him go. The door slammed shut behind him, and he was plunged into darkness. Days passed in a haze. Ethan's mind was unraveling, the edges of his sanity fraying like a loose thread. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a full meal or had a full night of sleep. His thoughts were a jumble of half-formed ideas, fears, and dread. And through it all, the woman was there, always watching, always waiting. Every time he tried to leave the house, he would see her in the corner of his eye, standing at the edge of his vision, her twisted smile never far behind. He could hear her voice calling his name, faintly at first, and then growing louder, more insistent. "Ethan, Ethan, come to me." The whispers would fill his ears, their constant maddening hum making it impossible to concentrate on anything else. He had no choice but to follow the pull, to give in to the curse that had latched onto him like a parasite. He had to go back. It was the only thing that made sense anymore. Ethan found himself driving down that same lonely road again, the road where it all began. The same stretch of highway, the same desolate landscape stretching out before him. The air was thick with fog, just like the night he had first seen her. The headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the empty road ahead, but the fear in his chest only grew stronger. He knew she was here, somewhere, waiting for him. As he drove, the fog seemed to close in on him, the road twisting and warping, stretching out into an endless expanse. Time felt distorted. His headlights flickered as the world around him blurred into a dreamlike haze. And then, just as he had feared, he saw them. The cars. A procession of vintage automobiles, their sleek chrome frames gleaming in the dim light. There were no drivers, just the sound of tires rolling on the road, the low hum of an engine. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what he had stumbled upon. The caravan, the curse, and this time, he wouldn't escape. As he followed the cars, the fog grew thicker, the road more twisted. He could feel himself being pulled deeper into the nightmare, the weight of the curse dragging him down into its dark embrace. And when he looked into the rearview mirror, he saw her again. The woman. Her eyes glowing faintly, her disfigured face twisted into that grotesque smile. The last thing Ethan saw before the darkness swallowed him was the glowing headlights of the phantom caravan, burning bright like the eyes of demons. And then, there was nothing. Ethan awoke in darkness. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, the kind of silence that feels too loud in its stillness, as if it is waiting for something terrible to happen. His body felt numb, as though he had been lying motionless for an eternity, his limbs stiff and unresponsive. He blinked, trying to make sense of his surroundings, but it was impossible to make out anything. His vision was clouded, his mind fogged, and he couldn't remember how he had ended up here. He tried to sit up, but his head swam, and he felt a wave of nausea roll through him. The last thing he could recall was the eerie procession of vintage cars and the woman's twisted smile. But now he found himself surrounded by a thick mist, unable to see even his own hands. He called out, but no sound escaped his lips. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, reverberating through the ground, vibrating in his bones. It sounded like the distant roar of an engine he knew all too well. The sound sent a shiver down his spine. His heart raced as he tried to move, but his body remained locked in place. Panic surged through him, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, the mist parted. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. The road stretched endlessly before him, but it wasn't the familiar highway he had traveled before. It was something far worse. The asphalt was cracked and weathered, covered in dark stains that glistened in the pale light, as if the road itself had been tainted by something ancient and malevolent. The cars, they were everywhere. A procession of antique vehicles, their headlights glowing with an otherworldly light, illuminated the dark expanse. But this time, there were more cars than he remembered. Dozens, hundreds, all of them lined up in a never-ending chain, stretching into the horizon. Each car was just as he had seen them before, sleek, elegant, and yet completely lifeless, as though they were nothing more than empty shells. There were no drivers, only the faint hum of engines. And there, in the front of the caravan, was the woman. Her pale face gleamed in the soft glow of the headlights, her disfigured features even more grotesque than before. Her eyes, glowing a sickly yellow, locked onto his, and for the first time, Ethan understood. She wasn't just tormenting him, she was showing him the truth, the curse that had bound him to this place. The woman stepped forward, her mouth curling into that familiar, twisted smile. "You couldn't run from me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "You should have listened. You should have picked me up." Ethan tried to scream, but the words caught in his throat, the sound choking him. The woman stepped closer, her feet gliding across the ground like she was floating, her body moving with an unnatural grace. She reached out and touched his face, her cold fingers sending a jolt of ice through his skin. "Now you're mine," she said softly, her voice filled with dark satisfaction. "Just like all the others." Ethan's world began to spin. The mist, the cars, the woman, they all blurred together into a chaotic nightmare. He tried to move, to run, but his body was heavy, bound by some invisible force. He felt himself being dragged forward, deeper into the caravan. And then, he saw them, the faces of the lost. In the windows of the cars he saw them, familiar faces, but twisted, hollowed out, like shadows of their former selves. They were trapped here, just like him, caught in the never-ending loop of the curse. They had all made the same mistake. They had ignored the hitchhiker, had refused to stop, and now they were condemned to follow her for eternity. Ethan's mind snapped. In that moment he understood. The woman, the phantom hitchhiker, wasn't just a ghost. She was the curse itself, the manifestation of every lost soul who had failed to heed the warning. The souls who had been doomed to wander the road for eternity, never finding rest. Ethan screamed, his voice a raw, animalistic cry, but no one heard him. The cars continued to hum, their headlights burning bright like the eyes of demons, their engines roaring louder and louder as the procession moved forward. And then, As if the world itself had decided to give him one final chance, the woman turned away from him. For just a brief moment, her gaze flickered toward the horizon, toward the endless road ahead. That was his opening. With every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan forced himself to move. His legs screamed in protest, his body begging for release, but he ignored it. He ran. He ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath ragged, the sound of the cars behind him growing fainter as he pushed himself further and further. The mist seemed to part before him, the road stretching out in front of him like a path to freedom. He could see the lights of a distant town on the horizon, faint but real. He knew he wasn't out of danger yet, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was hope. He was going to escape. But just as the town came into view, just as he thought he was free, he heard it, the roar of the engines, the hum of the cars, the woman's voice calling his name. And in that moment, Ethan understood. There was no escaping her. There was no escaping the curse. The headlights of the cars behind him flared to life, and the last thing Ethan saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the woman's twisted smile, glowing in the headlights like a demonic beacon. A few weeks later, Ethan's car was found abandoned by the side of the highway, just outside of town. The windows were cracked, the doors were unlocked, and the engine was cold. But there were no signs of Ethan, no trace of where he had gone, or what had happened to him. All that remained were the faintest traces of muddy footprints leading from the car, footprints that seemed to disappear into the fog, as if they had never existed. People who drove down that road late at night would occasionally spot the caravan of antique cars, their headlights burning bright in the distance. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you were lucky enough to spot it, you'd see a lone figure standing by the side of the road, waiting. Her pale face illuminated by the headlights, her disfigured smile never fading. Some say it's Ethan. Others say it's just another soul, trapped in the never-ending cycle, bound to wander the road forever. And if you stop, if you pick her up, you'll join them. Forever. Story number 4. It was a dark and moonless night when Claire and Daniel decided to take the road less traveled. Their plans for the weekend had been spontaneous. What started as a simple road trip had turned into an uncharted adventure, with their destination unknown and the destination itself far from their minds. They had long been on the road, navigating through quiet towns and sleepy suburbs. But now, after hours of driving, they found themselves facing a lonely, unmarked stretch of highway that no GPS could seem to locate. The road sign at the entrance was rusty, its paint faded almost to the point of invisibility. Yet the words were still legible enough to catch the attention of the tired travelers. "Toll road. Passage is not guaranteed," it read. Below, a strange message appeared in scrawled black letters. "Leave an offering to pass." Claire, a confident and practical woman, laughed. "Sounds like one of those creepy stories the locals like to tell to freak people out. We'll be fine. This is nothing but a random stretch of road." Daniel wasn't so sure. He had heard the rumors about this road from some locals during previous trips. There were tales of disappearances, strange lights in the distance, and voices on the wind that some said were the restless souls of travelers who had failed to heed the warnings. But he wasn't about to tell Claire that. He didn't want to sound like a superstitious fool. "It's just a local thing," Daniel said. "Probably a bunch of pranksters trying to spook us." Claire rolled her eyes. "If you're so worried, we'll keep the windows up and the doors locked. But let's keep going. No sense in turning around now." Without another word, she accelerated, the engine of their car humming steadily as they entered the toll road. The air immediately felt different. A thick, oppressive stillness filled the space between them, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Daniel adjusted the air conditioning, trying to ignore the creeping discomfort in his chest. The road stretched on for miles, winding through dense, overgrown trees whose branches twisted into grotesque shapes. The headlights of their car illuminated the path ahead, but the darkness beyond the reach of the headlights seemed to suffocate everything around them. The absence of any other vehicles only added to the feeling of isolation. "I don't like this," Daniel said, his eyes scanning the dark edges of the road. The silence outside was deafening. Claire was already glancing at the empty stretches of road ahead, but she kept her composure. "You're overthinking it. This is just another creepy road. You've heard the same stuff I have, but I'm not buying into it." Despite her words, Claire could feel the unease that had started to creep into her own mind. The eerie quiet had settled heavily over them, and the road felt as though it were pulling them deeper into the wilderness. The trees around them had grown thicker, their twisted limbs like fingers, reaching down to grab hold of them. It was as if the road itself were alive, and its mood had turned sinister. "Just focus on the road," Claire said, trying to reassure herself more than Daniel. But the longer they drove, the more she realized that something was off. The road appeared to stretch endlessly, as if there was no end in sight. The darkness pressed in around them. Claire turned on the radio to break the silence, but the static was all they could hear. No music, no voice. The crackling grew louder, almost unbearable, until suddenly, a voice emerged from the static, clear and chilling. "This is your last warning, travelers. You have entered the cursed toll road. Leave an offering, or you will never pass." Claire froze, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. Daniel's face turned pale. "What the hell?" he muttered, quickly reaching for the radio controls. He slammed the off button, but the voice continued, loud and demanding. "This road does not forgive trespassers. Leave your offering or face the consequences." Claire's knuckles turned white as she gripped the wheel harder. She glanced nervously at Daniel, whose face was taut with concern. "What the hell does that mean? Leave an offering? We didn't stop. There's nothing we could have left." But as she spoke, the road ahead seemed to stretch even further, like an endless ribbon of asphalt. The trees, which once seemed merely ominous, now looked as if they were closing in, their branches stretching out as though they were alive, reaching toward the car. The road had become suffocating, oppressive, and the more Claire pressed on the accelerator, the more she felt as though the car were being pulled backward, as if it didn't want to leave. "I don't like this," Daniel said again, his voice shaking. "We need to turn around." But it was too late. As Claire turned the wheel to retrace their path, they both felt the unsettling reality of their situation. The road ahead was now the same as the one behind them. There was no sign of the way they had just passed through. It was as if the road had folded in on itself, trapping them in a loop. "What the hell is going on?" Claire whispered, her voice tinged with panic. Daniel's eyes darted around. "It's like we're stuck. We're not going anywhere." But the strangest part was what appeared next. A faint, distant light, glowing dimly in the fog that had inexplicably appeared around them. It was the toll booth. The very same toll booth they had passed earlier, its rusted frame now emitting an unnatural light, casting an eerie glow across the road. A voice echoed through the car once again, this time deep, almost menacing. "You have trespassed. Pay the toll or face the consequences." The car crept forward, seemingly on its own, as Claire gripped the wheel with sweaty palms. She tried to turn the car around once more, but it was futile. The road remained endless. They were trapped. The toll booth was now directly ahead of them, its rusted walls glowing like something out of a nightmare. The booth had been abandoned when they first passed, its broken windows giving no hint of life. But now, it seemed alive, pulsating with an energy that Claire couldn't comprehend. She looked at Daniel, whose eyes were wide with terror. He was staring at the booth, his breathing shallow. "We need to stop. We need to do what it says. We don't have a choice." "Leave an offering?" What are we supposed to give it? We didn't even stop the first time. But even as Claire protested, they both saw the shadowy figures emerging from the trees on both sides of the road. They moved silently, figures cloaked in dark, flowing robes, their faces hidden in shadow. The figures didn't make a sound as they walked toward the car, but their presence was undeniable. They were real. They were coming closer. The light from the toll booth flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the road. Claire could hear the sound of whispers now, faint but growing louder, carried on the wind. The whispers weren't words. They were more like murmurs, too soft to understand, but enough to make her skin crawl. "We should just give them something," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "What? You think we're supposed to leave them our stuff? That doesn't make sense." But even as she argued, Claire knew the only way they would leave this road was by doing something, anything, to appease the spirits. But what could they offer? Their minds raced, thinking back to the signs they had passed. Leave an offering? But what would be enough to satisfy whatever dark forces held sway over this place? As if to answer her unspoken question, one of the figures moved closer to the car, its face hidden beneath the shadowy hood. Slowly, it raised a hand, pointing toward the dashboard, where Claire's phone lay resting on the seat. "That," the figure seemed to whisper, though no sound passed its lips. Claire looked at Daniel, her heart racing. Should we give them the phone? Before Daniel could answer, the toll booth's lights flickered again, and the voice from the radio boomed louder than ever. "Pay the toll." The figures were getting closer. They had no choice but to comply. Claire grabbed the phone, her hands shaking, and slowly pushed it out of the window, watching as the figure reached for it with an eerie calmness. But just as the figure touched the phone, the ground shook violently beneath them. The car jolted, and the whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, angry, desperate, pleading for something more. It was too late for the offering. The toll had been paid, but the road had other plans. The car shook again, its tires screeching against the rough, uneven asphalt, as if the road itself had come alive and was fighting to drag them into its dark grip. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced nervously at Daniel, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and terror. The toll booth flickered again, its dim light casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to stretch beyond reason. As Claire's hand hovered over the steering wheel, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread fill the car. The whispers that had once been faint murmurs were now a deafening roar, seeping through the air vents and buzzing in their ears. They came from all directions, but no source could be seen. It was as if the spirits themselves were surrounding them, pressing in with every passing moment. "We need to go, now!" Daniel shouted, his voice almost breaking. Claire slammed her foot down on the gas pedal, but the car barely moved. The engine sputtered, coughing in a way it never had before. The trees lining the road seemed to sway with an unnatural rhythm, their branches waving as if beckoning them to stop, to give in to the twisted forces surrounding them. With every attempt to push forward, the car lurched, as though it were being pulled back by invisible hands. The toll booth glowed brighter now, the flickering lights intensifying, casting a hellish light over everything. The figures that had once stood by the side of the road were now in motion, moving slowly toward them with an eerie, deliberate pace. Their faces remained hidden beneath dark hoods, but Claire could feel their eyes upon her. There was no escaping them. "We can't escape," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "We have to stop." Claire's breath quickened, her mind racing. The phone, the offering. She knew in her gut that it was more than just a symbolic gesture. The spirits weren't merely asking for a gift, they were demanding a price. A toll, the true meaning of which she had yet to understand. "I don't know what to do," Claire said, her voice shaky. This is wrong. We shouldn't be here." But before Daniel could respond, the voice from the toll booth blared again, louder this time, filling the air with a sinister command. Leave the offering, or face the wrath of the road. Claire's grip on the wheel tightened as her hands began to sweat. She could feel the suffocating pressure around them, as if the very air itself was thick with malicious intent. She glanced at Daniel, who was pale, his eyes wide in terror. It was clear that neither of them was going to be able to drive their way out of this. Whatever had control over this road, whatever cursed force lay hidden beneath the ancient toll booth, was not going to let them go so easily. The ground beneath them trembled once more, this time stronger than before. Claire's heart lurched in her chest. It was as if the very earth was alive and angry. The shadows around them grew darker, more pronounced, twisting into shapes that were impossible to decipher. The faint whispering voices now came from all directions, an overwhelming chorus of anguish and rage. Claire slammed the brake, bringing the car to a sudden stop. She looked desperately out of the windshield, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of escape. But the road ahead was as unending as it had been before. No exit, no escape. Just the endless stretch of black asphalt and the toll booth, standing ominously like an anchor to some dark, forgotten world. Then, the first figure appeared. It moved slowly, its feet gliding over the ground as if it were weightless. The cloak of the figure was tattered, its edges frayed, but the figure itself seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow, as though it were made of shadow and light in equal measure. Its hooded face was a blur, like a nightmare that couldn't quite form. It took another step forward and Claire's pulse quickened. Who are you?" she whispered, but her voice was swallowed by the dark. The figure reached out a long, thin arm, its bony fingers stretching toward the car. A low, guttural voice echoed from the depths of its hood. "Payment, payment, payment." The voice echoed over and over, like a chant, each repetition growing louder and more urgent. What do you want?" Daniel shouted, his voice trembling with fear. He had his hand on the door handle, as if contemplating running, but something inside him held him back. He knew they wouldn't escape. Not from this. The figure spoke again, its words sending a cold shiver down Claire's spine. "The road demands its price. The toll must be paid." A sudden flash of red illuminated the area, casting the figures in a hellish glow. Another figure emerged from the shadows, its form even more twisted than the first. This one was hunched, with long, spindly limbs, and its eyes were nothing but empty, black pits. The voice of the figure was deeper, almost otherworldly. "Leave your offering," it said, "or stay here forever." Before Claire could respond, the trees around them seemed to stir. The shadows twisted and began to move, their forms stretching and shifting in the dim light. It was as if the entire forest was alive, a thrumming, pulsating entity waiting for something. No, not waiting, demanding. The road itself seemed to call to them, urging them to comply. "I don't know what they want," Claire shouted, her voice breaking. She turned to Daniel, but he was already out of his seat, his hand reaching for the door. "No, don't!" Claire cried. "We can't leave the car. They'll—" But before she could finish her sentence, Daniel flung open the door and stepped out into the cold night air. His feet sank into the soft earth, but he barely seemed to notice. He moved with a strange, jerky motion, as if something was pulling him forward, dragging him toward the toll booth. "Daniel!" Claire screamed, reaching for him. But it was too late. The figures moved again, silently, gliding toward him like phantoms. One of them reached out with its long, skeletal hand, brushing against Daniel's shoulder. He froze, his body stiffening, and then slowly, his head turned toward Claire. His eyes were wide, but there was nothing in them. No recognition, no fear, just an empty, hollow stare. Claire's heart stopped in her chest. "No," she whispered. Before she could act, the figure dragged Daniel forward. His feet left the ground, his body being lifted by unseen hands. He reached out toward Claire, his mouth opening in a silent scream. But then he was gone, vanished into the darkness of the night, leaving only a faint, cold breeze behind him. Claire was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she watched the toll booth glow brighter, its rusted frame pulsing with an unholy light. The voices grew louder, the whispers merging into a cacophony of tortured souls. "Your payment is due," a voice boomed from the booth. The car shook violently again, this time tipping to one side, as if the spirits were pulling it down into the earth itself. The figures that had been surrounding them moved closer, their shadows stretching out like claws, reaching for Claire. In a final act of desperation, Claire slammed the car into reverse, flooring the gas pedal with all her might. The car jerked forward, the tires screeching against the pavement as she tried to escape. The toll booth and the figures faded into the distance, but she knew the road was not done with her yet. The darkness around her seemed to stretch endlessly, the road ahead unyielding and infinite. She glanced at the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of the toll booth, no sign of the figures. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive weight in the air seemed to lift. But Claire knew better than to believe she was free. The road had claimed Daniel, and it wasn't done with her. Not yet. The road stretched endlessly before Claire, an unyielding path that seemed to coil into infinity. Her pulse pounded in her ears, the sound of her frantic heartbeat mingling with the echo of the voices that still lingered in the air, haunting her. The toll booth, gone for now, had left behind nothing but a terrible memory. Yet Claire knew deep in her gut that she hadn't truly escaped. She didn't dare glance at the rearview mirror again. The terror of seeing those figures, those specters, was too much. It was as if the very road was alive, pulling her deeper into its embrace. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, and her eyes darted to the road ahead. But no matter how fast she drove, the scenery refused to change. The moon, once a calming silver beacon, now appeared as a sickly, distorted sliver in the sky, casting a pale, eerie glow over the endless highway. The trees along the side of the road had long since stopped resembling anything real. Their twisted forms loomed over her like ominous sentinels, their branches stretching and clawing at the air as if to claim her. Her mind was racing, thoughts a chaotic blur of fear and disbelief. Had she really just seen Daniel vanish into thin air? Had the spirits of the toll road truly claimed him, as the voices had warned? The road, it wasn't real, at least not in the way she had once believed. The toll booth wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a living, breathing curse, a part of something far darker than anything she had imagined. She had been warned, but she hadn't listened. Now she was paying the price, and yet there was no turning back. Every inch of the road ahead seemed like an endless loop, like she was caught in some kind of twisted purgatory. Claire's eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She would not succumb. She would not let this cursed road take her as well. But then, the car began to sputter. At first it was barely noticeable, a slight cough from the engine, as though it were struggling to keep up with the relentless pace. Claire, already on edge, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands tightening on the wheel. Then it happened again. A loud, disturbing clang from beneath the hood, followed by a series of violent shudders. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at the dashboard, but the gauges were all normal. The gas tank was full. The engine was fine. Everything was as it should be, yet something was wrong. The sputtering continued, growing louder, more pronounced. Claire pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to keep the car moving, to push past whatever this was. But the road refused to cooperate. The headlights flickered, casting long, disorienting shadows across the road. Her surroundings shifted, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling before her eyes. The trees were no longer just trees. They had transformed into twisted, grotesque forms, their bark mottled with deep red, dripping as if it were bleeding. The fog had thickened again, creeping over the road like a living entity. She slammed her foot down on the pedal, but the car continued to slow. Panic clawed at her throat. She had to get away. She couldn't afford to stop. Not here, not now. Suddenly, the car lurched to a halt. Claire gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The engine had completely cut out. She was stuck, alone, in the middle of nowhere. The toll road was all around her, its malevolent force closing in. She reached for her phone, only to find it had no signal. Her stomach churned with dread. There was no way to call for help. She sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. She couldn't just sit there and wait. Something was coming. She could feel it. Feel the presence of something watching her from the darkness beyond her headlights. And then, as if to prove her fear correct, the whispers began again. Low at first, like a distant murmur in the wind, they gradually grew louder, clearer. There was no mistaking it this time. The voices were real. They were coming from all directions, surrounding her. The spirits were near. Claire reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling, but before she could open it, the car door on the driver's side flew open by itself. Claire gasped, her body tensing. There, standing in the doorway, was one of the figures, its long, skeletal hand stretched out toward her. Its face was obscured by the hood, but she could feel its eyes on her, as if it were reading her very soul. "Leave the offering," the voice from the figure rasped, its tone as cold as ice. "The toll must be paid." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She knew she couldn't refuse, couldn't defy them any longer. The toll had already been paid in blood, in terror. Daniel was gone. She could feel it now, deep in her bones, that there was no way out of this. In the distance, she saw the faint outline of the toll booth again, the rusted structure gleaming in the distance as if it had been waiting for her all along. The unnatural glow had returned, flickering like a lantern in a forgotten graveyard. The figure reached for her again, its fingers sharp like claws. "Pay the price," it repeated, its voice growing more insistent. With trembling hands, Claire fumbled through the glove compartment, pulling out the only thing she had, a crumpled, faded receipt from the gas station they had stopped at earlier. It wasn't much, but it was all she had left. She held it up to the figure, but it didn't seem to recognize the offering. It only glared at her with its hollow eyes, its skeletal hand still reaching toward her. "No," she whispered, a cold sweat running down her back. "No, this isn't enough, is it?" The figure gave no response, but its presence grew stronger, its cold fingers closing in on her arm. Claire's heart pounded as she struggled to pull away, but the figure's grip was like iron, holding her in place. Suddenly, there was a sound, a sharp, loud crack. The toll booth, now glowing brighter than ever, seemed to come alive. The doors of the booth creaked open, as if inviting her in. It was then that Claire realized the toll booth was not just a symbol. It was a gateway, a threshold to a place beyond the living world. It wasn't just the spirits who were waiting for her. It was the road itself. The toll booth's glow intensified, casting long shadows over the road, and for the first time, Claire understood the true nature of the curse. With a desperate cry, she jerked away from the figure's grip and bolted toward the toll booth. Her feet pounded the asphalt, her mind screaming in terror as she ran toward what she feared most. But as she neared the booth, the air grew colder, denser, and the road seemed to twist and warp beneath her feet. The figures, those twisted souls, emerged from the shadows, surrounding her. She could hear their voices now, a maddening chorus of whispers that filled the air. "Payment, payment, payment." And then, just as she reached the booth, the darkness consumed her. The darkness swallowed Claire whole. For what felt like an eternity, she floated in a void of shadows and whispers. The ground beneath her seemed to disappear, replaced by an endless black expanse. The chilling voices surrounded her, their whispers threading through her mind like daggers. She couldn't escape. She couldn't move. Every direction was the same, empty, desolate, suffocating. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tightening as the weight of the silence pressed in on her. But even in the oppressive blackness, Claire knew something was terribly wrong. A sudden flash of light shattered the darkness. The glow was not warm. It was cold and unnatural, flickering like the light of a dying star. Claire blinked, trying to focus, but the light swirled and danced, twisting before her eyes. The toll booth. It was still there, looming like a sentinel. It was surrounded by thick fog, its rusted edges now gleaming with an otherworldly glow. The space around it seemed to distort, like a twisted reflection in a broken mirror. Claire stumbled forward, her legs weak, her vision blurred. She felt as though she were being pulled, drawn to the booth by an invisible force. "Do you wish to leave?" A voice echoed in the mist, one that was both distant and intimately close, as though it came from all around her. Claire froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew this voice. It was the voice of the figure, the one that had reached for her earlier, the one who had demanded payment. I don't," Claire stammered, her words faltering in the oppressive air. Her throat felt tight, as though the very atmosphere was choking her. "Please, I want to go home." The booth's glow flickered again, and the shadows surrounding it seemed to gather closer, closing in like a trap. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Everyone must pay their toll. Claire's body tensed, the weight of the words sinking into her bones. She could feel the reality around her beginning to shift, bending and warping like something unstable. This wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a liminal space, neither here nor there. Who are you?" Claire gasped, trying to make sense of the nightmare she was trapped in. The shadows within the toll booth seemed to shift, taking form. In an instant, a figure appeared before her. A tall, gaunt man, his face hidden beneath a tattered cloak. His features were obscured, but his presence was suffocating. He radiated power, a force that seemed to stretch through the air like an invisible thread. "We are the keepers of the toll," the figure intoned, its voice deep and rasping. "We are bound to the road, to the endless cycle. We are the ones who guide the lost to their fate." A wave of nausea hit Claire as the figure spoke, the weight of the words dragging her down. She tried to speak, to ask more, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat. Her mind was reeling, desperate to understand what was happening, but the answers remained elusive, hidden behind the veil of shadows. "Payment is required," the figure repeated, its voice gaining an edge of finality. "Your offering. What have you brought?" Claire's heart raced. She didn't have an offering. She had nothing. The only thing left of her life was the crumpled receipt from the gas station, and that had been rejected. She was empty-handed. The toll booth, once an imposing structure, now seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the rusted metal groaning in protest, as if the very building were alive and waiting for something. I don't have anything," Claire cried, her voice breaking as the panic rose within her. "I just want to leave. Please, I'll do anything." The figure before her stirred, its form becoming more solid, more terrifying. The cloak rippled like a storm on the horizon, and the shadows that danced around it seemed to grow teeth, gaping mouths that threatened to devour her whole. "You will give an offering," it said, its tone dark and final. "Your soul will be the toll." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. Her mind whirled with the enormity of what was being asked of her. She was not just being asked to give something physical. She was being asked to surrender everything she had, her life, her future, her very essence. A scream rose in Claire's throat, but it was choked off as she felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. The earth cracked, and the toll booth began to shake violently, as if it were shaking with rage. The shadows seemed to reach out, wrapping around her legs, pulling her toward the booth. "No," she screamed, trying to pull away, to escape. But the shadows had already wrapped themselves around her, pulling her deeper into the void. The figure moved closer, its hand stretching out toward her. "You cannot escape the toll," it said. "You are already ours." With a surge of adrenaline, Claire forced her legs to move. She dug her heels into the ground, trying to break free, but the shadows tightened around her like chains, dragging her toward the figure. The toll booth's light flickered one final time, and Claire saw, in the fading glow, the figure's face. It was not human. It was monstrous, a writhing mass of features, an amalgamation of faces, all twisted in agony and despair. Eyes that burned with an otherworldly fire stared back at her. "Your soul is the price," it intoned once more, the words filling the air like a funeral dirge. And then, in a final desperate effort, Claire did the only thing she could think of. She reached for the toll booth itself. With trembling hands, she grabbed the edge of the booth, and for a split second, everything went still. The shadows paused, the whispers ceased, and time seemed to freeze. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She didn't know if it would work, but it was her only choice. With all the strength she could muster, Claire hurled the crumpled receipt toward the toll booth. The moment it made contact with the rusted metal, a flash of blinding light erupted from the booth. The shadows recoiled, the figure howled in fury, and the very ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble in pain. Claire's heart raced as the light grew brighter, blinding her until it enveloped her completely. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever would come next. The light from the toll booth was blinding, and for a moment, Claire felt like she was falling through a whirlwind of colors and sounds. Her body was weightless, as if suspended between two worlds. The oppressive shadows clawed at her, but they couldn't touch her anymore. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light flickered, and everything fell silent. Claire opened her eyes. She was no longer in the cursed road. She was standing in a quiet field, the grass beneath her feet soft and damp from the night's dew. The sky above her was clear, the stars twinkling peacefully. It was as though she had been transported to a completely different place, a place untouched by the horrors she had just experienced. For a long moment, Claire stood there, confused and disoriented. She looked around, taking in her surroundings. There were no shadows, no toll booth, no twisted figures lurking in the distance. The night seemed so calm, so peaceful. Could it be that she had escaped? Had the toll booth's curse finally been broken? A sudden wave of exhaustion swept over her, and Claire sank to her knees in the grass. She hadn't realized how much fear and dread had drained her until now. Her heart pounded in her chest, but the silence of the field was a welcome reprieve from the terror she had faced. And yet, deep down, a small voice in her mind whispered a warning. This isn't over. It can't be. Before she could dwell on the thought, she heard the faintest sound behind her. It was so subtle at first that she thought it was just her imagination, but it grew louder. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was approaching. Claire spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing at the edge of the field, was the toll booth. It had reappeared, just as twisted and horrifying as before. The rusted metal gleamed in the moonlight, its corners sharp and jagged. A faint glow pulsed from within, and the shadows around it seemed to writhe in anticipation. The figure, the keeper of the toll, emerged from the booth. It was still cloaked, but Claire could feel its presence now more than ever, as though it were drawing strength from the booth itself. It stood motionless, watching her with unseen eyes. "You cannot escape," the figure's voice boomed, resonating with a power that rattled Claire's very bones. "The toll must be paid." Claire's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. She hadn't escaped. The field, the stars, the silence. It was all an illusion, a trap, a temporary reprieve. The toll booth had simply lured her into a false sense of safety, preparing for the final act of the ritual. "No!" Claire cried, scrambling to her feet. "I won't give you what you want! You can't have me!" But the toll keeper only tilted its head slightly, the cloak swaying ominously. "You do not understand. You are bound to the road now, as all who fail to pay the toll are." With a surge of panic, Claire turned and bolted. She didn't know where she was running to. She didn't even know if she could outrun whatever was chasing her. All she knew was that she had to keep moving. The figure's voice echoed in her ears, growing louder with every step. "You cannot run from your fate, Claire," the toll keeper intoned, the words cutting through the air like a whip. "The road claims all who trespass, and you are no different." Claire's heart raced as she stumbled through the field, her legs trembling beneath her. Her eyes darted around, looking for any kind of escape, any hope of freedom. But the field stretched out in every direction, endless and unyielding. Then, as if by some divine intervention, she saw it, an opening in the distance, a glimmer of light, a faint trail leading into the woods. It was small, but it was enough. Claire didn't think. She just ran toward it. The toll keeper's voice grew fainter, but it wasn't over yet. She could still feel its presence closing in, and the shadows in the field seemed to stretch toward her, trying to pull her back. Just as she reached the edge of the woods, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The invisible wall. Claire slammed into it with a violent force, her body ricocheting back like a rag doll. Pain exploded through her chest, but she didn't have time to react. The toll keeper was there, standing before her, blocking her only escape. "Did you really think you could outrun your fate?" the figure sneered, its voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. Claire's mind was spinning, her vision blurred with tears of frustration and fear. She was trapped. She had nowhere to go. And the toll keeper was closer than ever. But then, in a moment of pure desperation, Claire reached into her pocket. She didn't know what she was looking for, but her fingers brushed against something. Her heart skipped a beat. The crumpled receipt. She had forgotten it. She had thought it worthless, a discarded piece of trash from the gas station. But in that moment, it felt like her last hope. Without thinking, Claire tore the receipt in half and threw the pieces at the toll keeper. A violent burst of light erupted from the fragments, blinding her. The toll keeper screamed. The light was not like the cold, unnatural glow that had plagued her before. This was different. It was warm. It was powerful. It consumed everything in its path. Claire closed her eyes as the light enveloped her, and for a brief moment, she felt weightless, free. The toll keeper's voice vanished. The oppressive shadows dissipated, and the world seemed to reset itself. When Claire opened her eyes, she was no longer in the field. She was back on the road, alone, but safe. The toll booth was gone. The curse had been broken. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The air felt fresh and crisp, and the road ahead seemed empty, unassuming. But Claire knew better now. She would never forget the horrors she had faced, the toll road's eternal grip, or the price of freedom. The road would always be there, waiting for its next victim. And as she drove off into the night, Claire couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere out there, someone else would be foolish enough to ignore the warnings. The toll road would always claim its due. Now that you've heard these terrifying tales, which story sent the biggest chills down your spine? Or do you know of any haunted roads that deserve to be on this list? Let me know in the comments. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. And remember, your story might just be featured in our next video.